Aloha, everyone. We're going to get started here in a moment. Yep. Please, folks in the lobby, please come on in. You're welcome to join us. I'm going to take a deep breath. Whew. We're here. We made it. Aloha and Velina. To the HSD Engage speaker series featuring Gina Starblanket and Leroy Little Bear, who will be speaking about the Buffalo Treaty. We are so excited to be able to be here today and to hear more about the work that these two amazing humans have been doing for a very long time. My name is Hokulani Aikau. I am standing here in my role as Acting Associate Dean Research for Human and Social Development. I'm also a faculty member in the Indigenous Governance Program. I'm also Kanaka Oiwi, and on my dad's side, my family comes from Maui and Molokai, and on my mother's side, I'm like Welsh and British, white settlers. On my mother's side. And with that settler ancestry, I also acknowledge that while I'm committed to Aloha Aina and the uplift of my Kanaka ancestors and of indigenous peoples everywhere, I also acknowledge that as someone with settler ancestry, I also have reparations and reparative work to do on that side, so that as I move forward with my children and my children's children, that we move forward in a good way, in a way that isn't as destructive as the path that we have walked along to get here. So those are my commitments. Those are commitments that I have had the opportunity to renew recently. It's a commitment that I made when I first joined the faculty here at UVic a year ago, and then it's a commitment that I renew. It's a commitment that I renew every time I do a land acknowledgement. I think it's something that the land acknowledgement, as we gather here at the University of Victoria, we acknowledge that these are Lekwungen territories, that the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Wasanich continue to have historical and ongoing relationships with this place. So the ancestors are all around us. We sit here in the ceremonial hall, and the physical representations of all of their ancestors are with us in a very present, meaningful way. And I'm humbled by that. And again, what that means to me is that it asks me to reflect in a critical, material kind of way about how I am carrying the responsibilities of being a guest on these lands, an uninvited guest, but one who's trying to live into the responsibilities of what that looks like. In Hawaiian, the word for land is aina, that which feeds. So when I think about being on lands, I'm thinking about all the ways that I and my family are fed spiritually, physically, emotionally by these lands. And what I've learned from my teachings is that because the land feeds us, it isn't something automatically. It comes because of our reciprocal relationship with those lands. So I'd like for us all just to take a moment to critically reflect on how you are or aren't in right reciprocal relationship with the land that we are on, and the people who have been stewards of these lands for a very long time, from time immemorial. So I just wanted to give us a moment just to pause, to think about what our individual responsibilities are and how we are carrying them forward. And in order to start in a good way, while we're thinking about our individual sort of responsibilities, we are also here as a collective in this moment. So I'd like to invite Kathy LaFortune up to welcome us in a good way in the ways of these lands. So I invite her to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our house. This house is, we have one rule in this place. When you come in here, leave all your troubles at the front door. You come in and you can say what, you're always welcome, and you can say whatever's on your mind and stuff like that. This house is built quite similar to a lot of the houses we have here on the coast, and some people call them long houses. We call them home because our families lived in them, hundreds of years ago. We had multiple families in our homes because it was easy to work together and keep food, feed each other and keep warm and stuff like that. So our tradition is to welcome everybody. Whenever you came to this land, you were welcomed with open arms. We fed you and clothed you, give you a nice place to sleep, and that's been the tradition of our people for hundreds of years. So, Lequaman, Zonkees, Esquimalt, Wissahick people. I'm Coast-Salish. I'm from Sayut. My reserve is Wissahick, and I'm an artist, and I'm just learning to be an elder. I'm an elder in learning, I guess. Me and my girlfriend here, so. We'd like to welcome you all, and we're pretty excited to hear the words of this wise man here, and welcome. And I think my girlfriend wants to say something. I've talked too long.
Welcome, everyone. I'm also of Sayut, but I was born from Nuu-chah-nulth heritage, west coast of this Vancouver Island. Nuu-chah-nulth territories in Potchidot, Port Renfrew, and Sishot and Port Alberni. Very honored to come here and welcome each and every one of you. Our Creator has brought us together in such a wonderful way to share words, to share hopes, to share wonderful conversations. So in our traditional ways, when we gather, have good conversations, these conversations are brought back to our communities, our families, our governments, our towns, to hopefully broaden the range of the wonderful works that have been happening throughout Canada, the US. Here at UVic, we're working towards a very inclusive, open-hearted, open conversation with all of our First Nations from around the world. And that I thank the Creator for bringing us here to share good thoughts, good words, and a good spirit. Haichka.
Thank you, Auntie Kathy and Uncle Doug. We really appreciate you setting us on a good path for tonight. Let's see. The next person I want to invite to the podium is Jennifer White, the current acting dean for HSD.
Thanks, Hoku. Thank you, Kathy and Doug, for your very generous and warm welcome to this beautiful space. I completely agree with you. It's a space that's meant for conversations like this. And Hoku, thank you for your opening remarks and your invitation to think deeply about how we're each situated in this colonial place we call Canada. I think that's a good reflection for us to all do. I am the acting dean here in the Faculty of the Human and Social Development, and I think it's just so exciting to see so many of you here at this really important learning event. And it's actually part of a series of things that our faculty has been sponsoring over the last couple of years. This is the third one we've done. And the idea behind them is that it's an opportunity to really showcase the important work that our researchers and their collaborators are doing to pursue a more just, sustainable, decolonial, equitable future for all of us. And I think we know that part of that is pursuing paths that put us into right relations with one another, with the land, and with all living beings, which I think we'll hear a lot about tonight when we hear about the Buffalo Treaty. And I know this is something that Indigenous people have known and practiced for thousands of years, and this is deeply known wisdom. The only other thing I want to say is that this kind of public event also really exemplifies the kind of values that the Faculty of Human and Social Development stands for. We are really committed to doing more of this kind of community engagement, where we bring people together in conversation about the most pressing issues that we're all facing, whether it's climate injustice, Indigenous sovereignty, health and well-being, and opportunities for us to think more deeply together about how we're both co-implicated in some of these problems and that we need to be part of the solution together. And I think HSD is very well positioned. Our researchers and our faculty and our staff and our students are on the cutting edge of doing this important work. So I'm really looking forward to the teachings that we're going to hear tonight from Leroy and Gina, and I'm so delighted you're here and deeply honored to have you here with us this evening. So thank you.
And now for the main event. I want to invite Gina Starblanket, my friend and colleague, to the podium. She's an associate professor in the Indigenous Governance program, the School of Indigenous Governance. Status change there. Yeah, let it be known. It's recorded, so it is there. So Gina is the principal investigator for a SSHRC funded grant titled Prairie Relationality Network, and this work that she's been doing with Leroy is a part of that funded grant. In addition to that work, she is also co-author of Storying Violence, Unraveling Colonial Narratives in the Stanley Trial, and co-editor of Visions of the Heart, Issues Involving Indigenous Peoples in Canada, and she is the forthcoming editor for the third edition of Making Space for Native Feminisms. With that, I'll turn it over to Gina.
Thank you, Hoku. When HSD asked me to do this event, oh, sorry, Jeff, I've been told so many times not to touch these things. You'd think they would sink in, ever, but I promise I'll get it one day. When HSD asked me to do this event and emphasized, that it was an opportunity to think through how knowledge is co-constituted in relation to the communities and partners that we work with, and asked me if I had anyone that I might think of presenting with to talk about some of the work that I do. I swear, Jeff, I'll get this one day. To talk about some of the work that I do, and what, they asked me what would maybe be of interest and relevant to community members. For me, there was never any question of who I would ask to come. And I asked, and then I asked again and again and again, and we finally got you out here, Leroy. This has been it was actually part of my letter of offer was, I had to bring Leroy Little Bear out and now they can't fire me. No, I'm kidding, no. Leroy was the most natural fit for the work that we do at the Prairie Relationality Network, which, just to tell you a little bit about, is a partnership of academics from across over 6 institutions in Canada who have connections to the prairies, who are interested in thinking through, and holding up the works of our own thinkers. And so for me, as someone that grew up in the prairies, and, I was trying to think of someone not only who is one of our leading thinkers, one of our own, I think, sort of beacons of Indigenous philosophy and theory and analysis in the prairies over different generations, but is someone who really exemplifies the form of learning that we take on and strive to commit to in human and social development. And by that, I mean, the work that we've tried to do in relation to Leroy, it's a really interesting time period because a lot of it started prior to COVID, and then we used visiting as a methodology for our proposal, and then COVID hit. So we have two elders, knowledge keepers that we wanted to work with as part of this proposal, and we sort of had our hands tied, what do we do? How do we actually implement and execute this research? But what turned out was a series of visits. We use visiting as a method. It is the most rich and generative method for us, for members of our network who are learning from many different angles. We have researchers working in the prairies who are taking up these perennial questions, trying to draw on our own resources. And what better way to do that than to have a series of visits with and again, honor the work that we have the chance to be exposed to in our relationship with Leroy, to sit with him in that knowledge and ask questions, and then to really give that relationship time. I think there was a lot of ideas we had about outputs at the beginning, but really for many of us, that process of visiting was the most important part of the project. And from there, we've had a chance to create different forms of knowledge mobilization from those visits. So some of those are academic facing, some of those are, different initiatives that we're collaborating on, and some of those are community and youth facing. So for this event, I was just so pleased that you were able to join us. And I also want to comment and hold up Amethyst for the amazing work that you always do and don't always get seen for, but Amethyst is always right here speaking so eloquently about all of these governance questions and things as well. And so I really appreciate you being able to join us as well, Amethyst, today. So that's a little bit about the Prairie Project and how our relationship with Leroy emerged. Again, just through those forms of relationship-driven inquiry that we prioritize in our work with our partner scholars. We also situate our partners as knowledge holders and as co-authors, as academics, because we know, well, in respect of that intergenerational knowledge transmission, that we are certainly, receiving many gifts from them, but we also see our partners as our co-authors, as our collaborators. It's not for an extractive sort of relationship for us. It's one where the knowledge itself is emerging and our insights and analysis emerge through those conversations. So I have been so lucky to be part of these visits. I like to see this gathering as another one of those visits, but on a broader scale. And I'm so deeply excited for the insights and lessons that I stand to learn from being able to bring Leroy out here to talk a little bit about some of the work that he's doing on the treaty, and that Amethyst is also doing on the treaty, and that many of us are trying to help out with when we can. So I'll just say a little bit about Leroy's many achievements and contributions to the field before turning it over to Leroy to talk a bit about the treaty for us. So Leroy Little Bear is one of the, I would say, most long-standing and consistent contributors to prairie indigenous philosophy since the 1970s. He has contributed and become a well-recognized knowledge holder in areas of citizenship, constitutional studies, indigenous rights, and sovereignty. And this, incredibly, hasn't just been in the academy, it's been at local, national, and international levels. So locally, he drafted the Constitution for his nation, the Kainai, in the 1980s. Nationally, he has co-authored or co-edited foundational texts on self-government, while also contributing to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Internationally, he was a founding member of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations and has contributed to building what would later become the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He's a leading philosopher of Blackfoot and Plains Indigenous epistemology. And for instance, his article, Jagged Worldviews Colliding, from the early 2000s, I think from 2000, so 22 years ago, is a widely cited and influential account of the impact of colonization on Indigenous studies. And I would say just as impactful and meaningful today as when it was first authored. He also engaged in a 20-year dialogue with the natural sciences about the connections between Western scientific theories and Indigenous cosmologies. His work places the complex and dynamic traditions of Blackfoot stories of creation, land, and relationships in conversations with scientific theories exploring the pace humans occupy in the natural world. So one of the things that is so exciting about Leroy's contributions is that they've really exceeded the sort of disciplinary forms of containment that we might see in the academy, and have had such a broad impact, again, across disciplines, from everywhere from undergrad to graduate levels, to faculty, right, to working with faculty at universities around how to undertake and integrate Indigenous philosophies and Indigenous programming within their own institutions. But it's especially important for scholars of Indigenous governance, because for those of us that are situated in the academy, and particularly at UVic here, one of the things that we're trying to do in our approach to Indigenous governance is really enact the theories and ideas and visions and political commitments that we talk about every day. When we talk about revitalization and when we talk about relationality and we talk about our connections to land and to the living earth, and how to think about governance from a truly Indigenous perspective and location, regardless of where you're from, Leroy's insights have been so crucial in how to dislodge some of our ideas, or Western ideas of the political, of political institutions, of who political actors are, right? And to get away from that anthropocentric idea of only humans interacting in contemporary forms of governance. It has changed for many of us, myself speaking, or I can speak for myself here, but I know many of us as well, has changed the way in which we think about what Indigenous political life can and should look like. And so here, I'm just so excited that we have a chance to hear about your to literally witness your intellectual contributions, but also the way you really embody this ethos in all of your relations. And I'm so grateful for how you've modeled that for myself and for so many of us who make up the faculty at iGov. Leroy was a professor for Debbie, for Dawn, for many of us. And so I just want to, on behalf of our school, thank you for everything you've given to us throughout the years, and that you continue to give as we're at this juncture where we're all working to try and figure out what to bring forward, and then also what sorts of transformation we need to initiate. So it means a lot to have you come as we're undertaking this work, and to have you come see a little bit of where I do some of my work too, far away from home. So with that, I'll just I'll hand it over to Leroy, and thank you, hi, and yeah, I look forward to many more visits after this one. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that generous and kind introduction. That was the song for the Buffalo Treaty. Nistoan na kauk. Ika skiniwa. He naksiks. Kainau. Ksauki tapiwa. Hinay nuchtu tsitapi. Ksikukanak sa matsanok puanok. Ksistikoisk. Tsiksani tsip kitamuk swai. Kakastutui. Itsinikuchswai. I was just introducing myself in my language, Blackfoot. My Blackfoot name is Lowhorn, Ikaskini. I'm of the Small Robes clan, and we're of Kaina, sometimes referred to as the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta. And we're of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I'm here to tell you about the Buffalo Treaty. I was invited to share thoughts with you about the Buffalo Treaty. But I would like to firstly say and give my thanks to the people that invited me to come and share the thoughts with you, and to thank our elders for their opening prayer and the thoughts and so on, and to the people whose territory that we're on today. But before we get into the story about the Buffalo Treaty, whenever I come to the coast, I always think about kings and queens. You know why? Because I think about reigning monarchs. And, you know, we always tease each other, you know, as tribes, you know, and we always tease each other and tell jokes about each other and so on. And one of them was people, you know, told us about Blackfoot, and this one guy was saying that he was Blackfoot. He said he was having an ID problem. And what's the ID problem? He says, well, ever since Canada went metric, we couldn't say Blackfoot anymore. And so black meter doesn't sound very good. And the other one was, one of our elders was saying, whenever we wear out our moccasins, wear big holes on them, on our feet. We used to, being from the plains, we used to go over the mountains and we'd go for a shoe swap. You can tell. We had many good stories and so on, you know. But Gina was mentioning something about philosophy. Let me just very quickly tell you so that you'd have a good idea about treaty as we understand it. And I'm speaking from a Blackfoot perspective, but I do know that it's not very different from talking to our friends on the coast and interior and so on elsewhere. But what I do tell people is that every morning you wake up and you think you're waking up to a reality, This is the way it is. Reminds you of Paul Harvey, I should say. He used to say, now let me tell you the rest of the story, okay? Well, the thing is, we never stop and think of the foundational base upon which that reality that you think is real, what it's based on. You just simply get up and you do. See, you just simply get up and you do. You never question with that foundational base. Let me very quickly tell you, a quantum physicist by the name of Steven Weinberg, and you can look him up, and he says, scientists they pride themselves in being very objective. And they talk about objective reality, okay? Well, he says that there is an objective reality out there. But as soon as you put a human being in the picture, it's not the reality anymore. It's the human interpretation of that objective reality. So what you're waking up to every morning is the human interpretation. That's what you're calling real. See? Now, how does that real come into being? Well, every society that forms, however that society comes into existence, sooner or later, that society claims a territory, okay? They claim a territory. And within that territory, you can say a culture, and I don't like the word culture because there's too much baggage, that anthropologists have brought about. I like to say a collective agreement that forms. And that collective agreement is based on all the totality of the relationships in the environment, in the territory, with the sky, with the plants, with the animals, and so on. And that collective agreement usually consists of three basic things. The theoretical, the etho aspect that we call paradigms or metaphysics, customs. Customs are accepted ways of doing things, and values, social values, which are kind of like social values are incentives. If you do these things, you'll get recognition, you'll get rewards. Or sometimes we use those social values for measurement, you know? Are you living up to the standards and so on, say. But those metaphysics are our interpretational tools. They're like a template that consists of, you know, criteria that says anything that comes to us that we take in, just like a computer input. This is how we're going to interpret reality. That's what we use for reality structuring, say. And so, when you look at Western, let me just clump European as Western, okay? And like I said, let me look at things from Blackfoot because that's what I think in and speak in. Let me start out, and I'll just very quickly, without going into it very deeply. On the Blackfoot side, we say it's all about flux, constant movement, constant motion, change, transformation, and so on. On the Western side, it's a stagnant world. This is how God made it. It'll be like this forever. See, I used to drink with Einstein. Remember him? He says, God does not play dice with the universe. He was half drunk when he said that. You know, see, you could see the difference. See, flux, constant motion, over here, stagnant world. If you move down the criteria, you know, over here, that flux is made up of energy waves. Those energy waves is what our elders, when they're talking about spirituality, in fact, the energy waves are the spirit. Over here, it's all about matter. It's a matter, materialistic notions. Okay? If I go on the Blackfoot side again, hey, over here, because everything is in motion, everything is alive. There's nothing in Blackfoot that's inanimate. Everything is alive. Okay? So I can talk about all my relations. So when we talk about all my relations, when elders say all my relations, they're not talking about humans. They're talking about those trees out there. They're talking about those rocks out there and so on. Over here, everything is inanimate except for you and I. So, everything is, and that's why we think I can do anything I want to the earth and to those trees and so on. They're dead. See, very different in thinking. On the Blackfoot side, hey, everything is about relationships. It's a web of relationships. Okay, it's all about relationships. On the Western side, it's all about, we may start out broad, but we always come to the point. In other words, hey, one right way, one true God, one right answer, and so on. See? Over here on the Blackfoot side, we always renew things. So in other words, if I'm in grade 7, as I always give as an example, and I ask a grade 3 question, or if I'm in fourth year in university and I ask a first year university question, the prof will tell me, you should have known that in your first year. Say, get with the program. Say. Whereas on the Blackfoot side, we repeat things all the time. We sing the same songs, we tell the same stories, we do the same ceremonies year in, year out. It's always about repetition. See? And the thing is, the language, reflects that. So in Blackfoot, everything is about action, everything is about process. Over here, it's all about naming things, categorizations. We have a box. We call a noun, we fill in the box. So that, hey, there can be many meanings to one noun, and so on. And over here, probably my biggest reference point is the land. In Blackfoot, I'm always referring to the land. That's why indigenous people always refer to the land. Even though the flux is going to change it, eventually, the land does not change as quick as other things. So at least for the time being, I can hang my head on it. See, over here, the biggest referent is time. See, it's the time notion. So, very different. When you understand these differences in basic metaphysics for reality structuring, then start to apply them to notions of things like we're talking about in Nashtsini, or if we want to try and translate it, treaty, very different concept. See. This one is all about relationship. This one over here starts to say, is it a contract? Is it a contractual arrangement? And so on. Say. So, when we talk treaty, treaties are signed by agreements between sovereigns. A lot of people talk in terms of treaty rights, okay? But sovereigns don't have rights. See, they have sovereignty. See, when sovereigns don't agree, even if they've entered into an agreement, when they don't agree, all you have to do is look at Russia and Ukraine. Okay? That's what happens. If the United States were to invade Canada, in spite of treaties that are in place between the two countries, that would be the difference. So in other words, treaties are agreements between sovereigns, and they're as good as the handshake and relationship between the two countries, the two sovereign states. See. So, if you were to keep those thoughts, the metaphysics and what treaties are about in international law, then we go to the notion of the Buffalo Treaty. The Buffalo Treaty came into existence as a result of discussions with elders. One of our students, Paulette Fox, was doing her studies in environmental science and was working with some of our elders. And we were out at one of those meetings, and the discussion about buffalo came up. And the concern of the elders was, being from the plains, that our relationship with these buffalo was so close that our songs, our stories, our ceremonies were based on that relationship between the buffalo and us. So much so that we could say we are the buffalo and the buffalo is us. See? And the concern was, the elders said, we tell those stories to the young, to the youth. They hear the stories, they hear the songs, and sometimes they're even participating in the ceremonies. But when you look out there, there's no buffalo to be seen. It's kind of like, if you're a good Christian, you can have all the Christian beliefs you want, but if you don't have that little corner church on the street corner, if you don't have crosses all over the place, see, you would be just a little bit less Christian, wouldn't you? See, there'll be something missing. There'll be that no kind of external connection, that relationship. See, well, that was the case. So that's the case with the buffalo and our people. So the elders said, we want to bring the buffalo back. So our people, our youth especially, in the future, can make those connections again. Okay? And so, after 5 years or so of what we call buffalo dialogues, where we just invite anybody that was interested would come and talk buffalo stories, experiences, and so on, come together. And after about 5 years, the elders eventually said, okay, I think we're all of one mind. We want to bring the buffalo back. But we can't do it by ourselves. It's an uphill fight. We've got to have partnerships and relationships. In the old days, we used to sign inashtisis. We used to enter into inashtisis, in other words, treaties, with some of our other tribes. Let's go and visit them, because we know the situation is the same in their communities as it is in our community. And see if we can all work together with them to bring that buffalo back. And so we did have emissary trips. And before you know it, we ended up having a delegation of people at the University of Lethbridge drafting the Buffalo Treaty as you see it out there. And in September of 2014, the Buffalo Treaty came into existence. Four of the American tribes, Fort Peck in eastern Montana, working westward, Fort Belknap, the Blackfeet Reservation, the Salish Kootenai, just over the mountains, and on the Canadian side, the Blackfoot Confederacy, along with Tsuut'ina or Sarcee, signed the Buffalo Treaty. And since then, there has been close to 50, I forget the exact number, there's close to 50 First Nations that have signed the Buffalo Treaty itself. The Buffalo Treaty, in other words, the signatories, the sovereign signatories to the Buffalo Treaty, have allowed non-sovereigns, in this case, organizations, in other words, NGOs, and individuals who support the terms and ideas behind the Buffalo Treaty to also sign as supporters, not as sovereigns, but as supporters. So we have hundreds of NGOs and probably now thousands of individuals that have signed the Buffalo Treaty. The Buffalo Treaty, if you read the preambular sections, talks about that relationship. We speak about the Buffalo Treaty as the buffalo, I should say, as a keystone species. It's a keystone species for the environment. It's also a keystone species for culture. Okay. Now, what do we mean by keystone? Well, especially for the youth, we try to explain the notion of keystone in the following terms. And that is, hey, think about a superstar on a professional sports team, like a LeBron James in basketball, okay? Well, when you think about it, he's the superstar, and the team is built around this superstar. So, if you were to remove the superstar, the team usually crumbles. Say, well, a keystone species like the buffalo, that's what happened. For the land, the ecological aspect and so on, especially on the plains, the plains were totally changed ecologically. Okay? And if you want to relate that to our present conditions today, well, think about it this way. It used to be out on the plains, I can drive down the highway, and it used to be my windshield on the vehicle would be totally plastered with bugs. Sometimes I would have to stop on the side of the road to clean the bugs off. Today, that does not happen anymore. Why? Well, because especially out on the plains, we spray everything, our fields, with pesticides. I can drive, from Edmonton down to Lethbridge, where we live. Maybe I might have a speck or two on the windshield, okay? Well, the birds, and I'm including the bat in those birds that we're blaming for the spread of COVID-19, okay? Because because of all those pesticides, is flying much further for their food, okay? Whereas before, it used to be able to feed locally. But now, it flies long ways to feed itself. And in the process, it becomes very generous with its viruses when it mixes with humans, say, COVID-19, say. That's the kind of imbalance that's brought about by the disappearance, ecological imbalance brought about by the disappearance of a keystone species like the buffalo. See? And we can say the same thing with the salmon over here. We can say exactly the same thing. We can tell you, and I'm sure our elders can tell you many stories. It's very similar. See? Well, so the Buffalo Treaty, itself, then says, okay, how do we want to implement that relationship, that keystone idea, okay? So if you read the Buffalo Treaty, it speaks to culture. It speaks to conservation first. The first clause it speaks to, conservation. Bring the buffalo back. And in fact, all over, especially out on the plains, buffalo are coming back. Many native communities are bringing those buffalo back onto their communities and so on for cultural purposes, and eventually, economics is down the line. Eventually, they may use them for economic purposes. It speaks to culture. In other words, we want to teach our kids, pass our knowledge down to the youth. It speaks to the notion of economics. It speaks to health. It's so much healthier to eat bison burgers than beef burgers. I guarantee you that. Because the buffalo has a different metabolic system than beef, so on. And the buffalo is also the best environmentalist you can have. Wherever the buffalo roams, it brings back birds and plants and other animals and so on. In other words, it becomes an eco-engineer. It becomes a bioengineer that helps to bring back that eco-balance That's why it's a keystone for the environment. And it speaks to education. Yeah. And all over, there's now starting to be buffalo curriculum cropping up, popping up here and there in schools and so on. And along with it, of course, language that was starting to be forgotten because the buffalo was not around. Now that the buffalo is coming back, hey, we're starting to make use of that language again and so on. So it's helping to revitalize, rejuvenate, bring back the memory and so on with regard to language. And it also speaks to research, because all the signatories and so on want to cooperate instead of each of them working in their own little silos and so on. Hey, let's share information and so on. And that way we can collectively bring back the notion of free roaming buffalo once again. So all those are the kind of things that the buffalo is kind of lighting a fire on underneath those kind of activities and so on. What has been in these few short years since 2014, what has been kind of like the success of the Buffalo Treaty? Well, education-wise, we're starting to get Buffalo Treaty. Buffalo curriculums and so on, cropping up. The culture and so on associated with the buffalo is coming back, so on. Hey, the governments are taking notice. On the American side, the American government came out with a report 3-4 years ago called the Bison Conservation Initiative. And they're saying we have to work with indigenous people on the return of the buffalo. One of their ideas is to have what they call mega herds of buffalo and so on. And the start of them is down, one of them is in South Dakota, Rosebud. Wawaloka is the start of those mega herds. They've already got 1,000 head of buffalo on the Rosebud Reservation. So on. They're going to be starting some more elsewhere and so on. The National Bison Range. I don't know if many of you know about the National Bison Range, but the idea behind the National Bison Range was a good idea, but wasn't done very well. Teddy Roosevelt, former President of the United States, was a conservationist, and he came out west before he was president and wanted to save the buffalo. Well, when he became president, without consultation with the Salish Kootenai in Flathead Country in Montana, the west side of the Rockies, he carved out the National Bison Range without their permission, without their okay. And the idea was good to save the buffalo, but he never consulted with the Salish Kootenai. And for over 100 years the National Bison Range has been there. Well, this past May, the National Bison Range has now been returned to the Salish Kootenai, along with all the buffalo and so on. It's been returned. And there are other programs and so on. We're in the process, and we're just really close, where we're working on having intertribal herds on both sides of the border, where number of tribes can work together in running and cooperating in terms of managing a herd and so on. And we're this close on both sides of the border in achieving the intertribal herds. We're also working on a transporter herd. In other words, having a corridor for buffalo to come back and forth across the border without them having to sign the Arrive Canada. Arrive Canada, they don't have to sign that. But have them, we're working on a corridor and so on. And we're very close to achieving that too. But in the meantime, our main focus is bringing the buffalo into the communities. And that's where our main focus right now exists, so that the culture, especially for the youth, can begin without any, without having to wait for anything else. Let's start that now, and so on. That's what's happened. Let me tell you a story or two about other things related to the buffalo and so on, and buffalo treaty and so on. One of the favorite stories Amethyst likes to tell about the buffalo is when we were dialoguing with the elders. There was going to be a road built, a new highway on the Blood Indian Reserve from our communities known as Standoff over to Lethbridge. The surveyors, non-Indian surveyors, were looking through their scope, and the main guy was looking through the scope, and he was looking, and he would stand there and look aside and look around. Finally, he asked one of his assistants, "Come over here and look through the scope." And the guy comes over and he looks through the scope, and he ended up doing the same thing. Kind of looks up the side, looks through the scope, and he says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, when I look through the scope, I see thousands of buffalo out there." And he says, "I see a camp over there, teepee camp over there." And the road they were surveying was going to go right through the camp. So those surveyors purposely, detoured around the camp and so on. And our elders said, "Oh, the buffalo spirit hasn't left. It's still here, still very strong, So that's a good sign for us." In Banff National Park, they had a plan to bring the buffalo back, but it was sitting on the shelf. But when the Buffalo Treaty came to be, the Banff National Park. Oh, yeah, we had a plan, Let's get it off the shelf. And they did. And they decided to implement the plan, and they brought they did bring buffalo back into the park as free-roaming buffalo. And some of the stories that came out of there one of them was, they had only been there, that is, the buffalo had only been there maybe a couple weeks. They started to see birds, magpies, land on the back of the buffalo to pull their hair off for their nests. And they were wondering, geez, those buffalo haven't been around for over 150 years. How did those birds know? In other words, maybe some genetic memory, or maybe it got stuck on some magpie's hard drive. I don't know. I don't know, but those birds remember that relationship. See? And one of our friends whose life has been with buffalo, we call him our buffalo grandfather. His name is Wes Olson, and in fact, he just came out with a book called The Ecological Buffalo. He was saying, it was on a wintry day. He said he was out maybe 4 o'clock or so on a foggy winter morning. He says, I was standing there, not a sound, but eventually I heard this jingling going on. It stopped, and then it started to happen again. He said, I was wondering what was that all about? He says, I better go find out. And this is up in the mountains and so on. So he went to go and explore, got closer to the buffalo, and here all the icicles had formed on the buffalo's hair. And when they walk, that's what was jingling. And he said we had told him about jingle dress dances. He says, that's what I was hearing. See? So there's many more stories we can tell you about the buffalo, but I had speeded up the video, so now I thought I would tell you some of the main points and so on. And if you have any questions or so, I would be glad to try and answer some of your questions, comments, or even just observations. Thank you so much.
We're going to get some questions. Hopefully we'll take the mic out to people. Thank you so much, Leroy. We're going to do we have some time for questions here before we wrap up. And so who wants to kick us off? I'll ask you to introduce yourself and also to frame it in the form of a question if possible. Hoku, do you want to? I'll pass through. Okay, yeah, you've got a big voice? Okay.
My name is Tara, and I'm an uninvited settler of Polish and Scottish descent. And I'm taking my master's in community development and doing my project, and I've decided to do the reconciliation project and teach non-Indigenous, so white youth, basically about reconciliation. So my question to you, Leroy, is if you could teach white kids anything about treaties and land, what would it be?
What it was? Repeat.
If you could teach non-Indigenous students one thing about treaty, what you would choose to teach them?
Well, one thing that I would teach non-Indigenous students about treaty is that sovereigns, when they enter into a treaty, there's, I forget the exact Latin terms, but the Latin terms basically say that the two agreeing parties promise to keep their word, okay? They promise to keep their word. And in Canadian parlance, legal parlance, Canadian talk, we call it honor of the crown, okay? So, and the courts have said, we cannot make a liar out of the crown. So when the crown promises to do something, we have to believe that it's doing it in good faith. Because if we don't, and if countries don't live up to their promises with each other through treaties and so on, you're going to get chaos. And we're experiencing that today with Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East and so on. We're experiencing that. So that's what we need people to understand. In our traditions out on the plains, when people entered into treaties, there's stories about people that made the agreements like chiefs and so on. If they met in person, they would turn around and run away from each other. They wouldn't come to each other and shake hands. They'd run away from each other. The idea being, if we start getting too friendly, we might compromise. So the best thing to do is actually not see or talk to each other. They would actually turn around and run away from each other for fear of compromise.
Yes, up in the corner. Yeah.
Hi, Leroy, could you tell us your best joke?
Your best joke. Your best joke.
There's too many.
There's too many.
They're all amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, over here. Over here.
I'm going to bring you a microphone so we can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Willow. I'm a member of Wilp Squidinir, Lakabu. Thank you. I think you helped me understand many things tonight. And when you talked about the buffalo and then paralleled that to the salmon, my heart, and I just thought about my family and my nation and all of the nations around here. And I thought, is there any lessons learned from the Buffalo Treaty that our people on the coast could take and maybe do the same for the salmon, for our salmon nation?
Yeah, very good point. As I've said, in the same way that the buffalo is a keystone species, in other words, a superstar, as I was explaining, the salmon is the same thing, okay, to our people over here. And we have, in fact, we have talked to and are starting to work with people on the interior, small group, working towards using the Buffalo Treaty as a template for a salmon treaty, okay? And we can't tell them, basically, we can tell them what we've done, our experiences with regard to the buffalo and so on. But in terms of saying, we may know the buffalo stories, but you guys know the salmon stories, the fish stories, and so on. So, but you could use the Buffalo Treaty as a template, and so on. And we'll be glad to support and work with you people. And we're starting to do that, yeah. And I would encourage that happens and so on. We're also working with another group down east in Manitoba that want to speak about water, the water spirit, and have a water treaty amongst our First Nations, because water is so important to us too. That water spirit is very important, because as I tell people, all of us, we never stop and think about it. It's one of those things like waking up in the morning. We think we're waking up to reality, but hey, when you think about it, it's really human interpretation we're waking up to. Well, with water, human beings, every human being is 65 to 70% water. So whatever you do to the water, you're doing to yourself. See? And newborn babies are 75 to 80% water. See? So water is very, very important. It's part of that spirit, it's part of us. We're at least 65% water. And so that's why that notion of maybe we should all get together to work towards a water treaty. And of course, with salmon, can't leave the water out. See? So we welcome that kind of cooperative approach, yeah. And that's what the Buffalo Treaty is talking about. Hey, let's all work together, as opposed to all of us just working in our own little silos. Yeah. So thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you. Anin, hello. Shaylin Wabagijik Indishnakas. My name is Shaylin Wabagijik. I'm Jaganash, European, and Omamawenini Algonquin. And my question for you, thank you for being here, is how did you, in the Buffalo Treaty process, unite nations? What were your methods, if you have any learnings from that process? Thank you. Miigwech.
Good point. And that how did we unite people? Let me use the example my wife always gives, the example. And we always use science as a reference. Why? Because if there was a conversation going on and you challenge one party, how do you know that? And the party says, a scientist or science says that usually is the end of the conversation because science said it, Well, that's not always true. The thing is that in Western science, without going into any deep explanation about it, see, Western science is all about measurement. That's what Amethyst is always try to explain to people, it's all about measurement. If it's not measurable, if it's not subject to measurement, it's not scientific. So you can't measure love. You can't measure feelings. So those are not scientific. See? Well, in indigenous science, it's all about relationships, okay? So much so that you could also say, if it's not about relationships, it's not scientific. See? And the message we're trying to give to the scientists is, that is Western scientists, is if you're only looking through the Western window, well, yeah, you get a certain small panoramic view, maybe. But if you were to add the indigenous science window to your window, you'd have a much broader window to look through, and therefore, you might come up with scientific discoveries that otherwise would not be available to you if you were only looking through this one singular window. See? So it's better to bring the measurement and the relationship window together so that we can have a much broader view. So when it comes to relationship building, okay, it's all about this notion of developing, lobbying, telling stories. Our elders are expert storytellers, telling the stories and so on. And it's talking to each other. Because if we don't talk to each other, we never know what's on your mind. I never know, you'll never know what's on my mind. See? The examples we give about that is when you're the CEO or the foreman, or somebody in charge, what an elder told me, you should never be afraid of complaints and criticisms from your fellow, from your employees, people below you. You should never be afraid of that. Because that's how you know what people want. That's how you know what people want. If you don't hear those, then you never know what people want. See? So it's really through good communications, that we develop relationships and so on, sharing ideas and so on. And I'll tell you one last story along that line. I forget the name, and I can get the name, but I forget the name. A scientist was wondering why certain schools, that is universities, were coming out with scientific discoveries and not other schools. And eventually he said, let me go find out. So he got on Uber and And he started to visit the different schools. And to make a long story short, he eventually came back, and his colleagues asked him, well, what did you find out? And he said, well, those schools that have, that are coming out with those discoveries and so on, and not other schools, so on, they have excellent dining facilities. And his colleagues kind of laughed about that and so on. Come on, what do you mean? And he says, no, I mean that. He says, it's in the dining room where all the different scientists, biologist, a physics prof, and so on, a chemist prof, and so on, they all come together and have coffee or have a meal. And they share ideas. They speak to each other and nurture each other and so on. And it's after a good, discussion over coffee or over a dinner, over lunch, that they go put on their lab coats, and that's where they make their discoveries. They don't do it in isolation. See? So it's through good communication. So, yeah.
On that note, I think it's a good one to end on, because what we've had tonight is really good learning, really good communication, insights into how we build those relationships so that we can move forward to new discoveries that are founded on a really important base. I really, really appreciated, I was going to take my mask off and then forgot. How you began with laying out the frameworks, a Blackfoot framework, and worldview, and a Western worldview, and the physical movement back and forth was just a constant reminder of that kind of tacking back and forth that we're always doing in the academy, that we're doing in life as we just manage the everydayness of our worlds. And I just really appreciated that lens that we can bring to all of our work. And in doing that, build stronger relations by having more conversations and acknowledging those different worldviews that inform the lenses that we bring to the world. So I really appreciate that work that you've done, your insights. I think it really speaks to the ethos and values of HSD and what we're trying to embody and what we're trying to do as a collective. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'd like to invite Amethyst up too. Again, this, as you have also been telling us, this is not a work that gets done in isolation or solo, that these are team efforts. And so, hands are full. So on behalf of HSD, Human and Social Development, we want to thank you both for coming, for all of the work that you do, for the relationships that you build, for the inspiration that you give to others to build those same relationships and move us forward to a new and better future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and from the School of Indigenous Governance, we have gifts for you as well, both, as an expression of our gratitude for coming to join us. Again, as I explained, at this great time for an exciting time for our program, but also, just to be able to honor your legacy to the field generally and the contributions you've made across those disciplines. So thank you so much again. Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you all for staying late. Many of us probably had really long days, and we made it to the end of this part of the day. There's probably more to come. And so thank you. Please be safe as you go home tonight. And yeah, we'll let you know when our next big event is, and we'll invite you all to it.